The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Officer Derek Martinez pushed through the heavy wooden doors, his leather boots echoing in the spacious hallway. He carried a thick folder stuffed with traffic citations, tickets he'd written over the past month that were finally getting their day in court. Derek had been a police officer for 8 years now, and courthouse visits were just part of the routine. He knew these hallways like the back of his hand. Today was going to be busy. His cases were scheduled in courtroom 3B, starting at 9 in the morning. Derek checked his watch and saw he had about 20 minutes to spare. He found a bench near the courtroom entrance and sat down, flipping through his paperwork. Traffic violations mostly. A few speeding tickets, some red light runners, and one case involving a driver who'd been going 15 miles over the limit through a school zone. That particular citation had been pretty straightforward. The driver had tried to explain she was new to the area and didn't realize it was a school zone during those hours, but rules were rules. Derek remembered being polite but firm. No warning, just a ticket. As he reviewed his notes, people started arriving. Lawyers in sharp suits walked past, chatting quietly with their clients. A few nervous-looking folks clutched their own paperwork, probably defendants representing themselves. The courthouse had that particular smell of old wood and floor polish, mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the vending machines down the hall. Derek had always found something reassuring about courthouses. They represented order, structure, the law being carried out properly. Around 8:45, Derek noticed more activity. The court clerk arrived, a woman named Sandra who'd been working in this building longer than Derek had been on the force. She nodded at him as she unlocked the courtroom doors. The bailiff showed up next, a veteran officer named Tom who handled courtroom security. They exchanged brief greetings. Everything seemed normal, just another Tuesday morning in traffic court. Then Derek saw her. A woman walked through the main courthouse entrance, moving with purpose and confidence. She looked to be somewhere in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. She wore a dark professional suit, the kind lawyers typically wore, and carried a leather briefcase that looked well used but expensive. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she had the composed expression of someone who spent a lot of time in courtrooms. Derek watched her for a moment, trying to figure out if he recognized her. Something about her face seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. The woman walked right past the gallery seating area where defendants and spectators were supposed to wait. She didn't stop at the clerk's desk to check in. Instead, she headed straight toward the front of the courtroom, past the bar that separated the public area from the working area of the court. Derek's attention sharpened. That wasn't right. You couldn't just wander around a courtroom like you owned the place. He stood up quickly, tucking his folder under his arm. Maybe she was confused about where to sit. It happened sometimes, especially with people who didn't have much courtroom experience, but she seemed too confident for that, too comfortable in her movements. Derek walked toward her, his officer instincts kicking in. Maintaining order was part of his job, even in a courthouse. "Ma'am, excuse me," Derek called out, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected over the years. "Defendants need to wait in the seating area." "You can't go back there," the woman paused. She turned to face him, and Derek got a better look at her. There was something in her eyes, a kind of calm intelligence that made him hesitate for just a second. But he pushed forward. Rules were rules, after all. "The gallery seating is right there," Derek continued, gesturing toward the benches where other people were starting to sit down. "You'll need to wait there until your case is called." The woman didn't argue. She didn't look angry or defensive. She simply looked at him with that same calm expression and asked, "Could you tell me your name, officer?" The question caught Derek slightly off guard. "Officer Martinez," he answered automatically. "And I need you to take a seat in the proper area. This is a courtroom and we have procedures." Several other officers who'd been standing near the back of the room noticed the interaction. Derek could feel their eyes on him. The bailiff, Tom, had also turned to watch, and Derek noticed something odd in his expression. Tom looked almost worried. But Derek was committed now. This woman needed to understand how things worked. "I'm not sure if you've been to court before," Derek said, his voice taking on a slightly patronizing edge. "But you can't just walk around wherever you want. There are specific areas for specific people. Attorneys sit at those tables, court staff work up front, and defendants sit in the gallery. It's really quite simple." The woman nodded slowly, taking in his words. She still hadn't moved toward the seating area. If anything, she seemed to be studying him, watching him with an attention that felt almost clinical. It made Derek uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. "I understand you're trying to do your job," the woman said, her voice quiet but clear, "but I'm going to need your full name and badge number." Now Derek felt his irritation rising. This was exactly the kind of thing that made his job harder than it needed to be. Someone who didn't want to follow simple instructions, who immediately started making demands and acting like they were going to file a complaint. He'd dealt with it before. Some people just couldn't accept being told what to do. "My name is Derek Martinez, badge number 4127, he said, his jaw tightening slightly. "And unless you want to add a contempt charge to whatever brought you here this morning, I suggest you take a seat. Now." The court clerk, Sandra, had been watching the whole exchange. Her face had gone pale and she seemed to be trying to catch Derek's attention. She was making small gestures with her hand, trying to signal something to him. But Derek was focused entirely on the woman in front of him. He wasn't going to let someone disrupt court proceedings just because they didn't feel like following the rules. More people had filed into the courtroom now. The gallery was filling up with defendants waiting for their cases, a few lawyers setting up at the counsel tables, and some spectators. They were all watching the scene unfold. Derek could feel the weight of their attention, but he told himself he was doing the right thing. Someone had to maintain order. The woman still hadn't moved. She stood there, hands folded in front of her, that briefcase still in her grip. She wasn't defensive or argumentative. She wasn't raising her voice or making a scene. Somehow that made the whole situation more frustrating for Derek. Why couldn't she just do what she was told? "This is your last warning," Derek said, his voice hardening. "Sit down in the gallery or I'll have to take further action." The bailiff finally stepped forward. Tom moved quickly, his hand reaching out to touch Derek's shoulder. "Hey, Derek," Tom said quietly, urgency in his voice. "We need to talk." Right now, but Derek barely heard him. He was too focused on making his point, on ensuring this woman understood that courtrooms had rules and everyone had to follow them. No exceptions. Derek shrugged off Tom's hand from his shoulder. He was too committed to this interaction now, too deep into making his point. The woman still stood there, completely unbothered by his warnings, and it was starting to really get under his skin. In his 8 years as a police officer, Derek had learned that respect for authority was essential. When an officer gave you a reasonable instruction, you followed it. Simple as that. "Look," Derek said, his voice rising slightly so everyone in the courtroom could hear him clearly. "I don't know what you think is going to happen here, but this is a court of law. We have rules. We have procedures. You can't just walk in here and ignore them because you feel like it." The woman's expression didn't change. She simply continued watching him with those calm, intelligent eyes. It was the kind of look a teacher might give a student who was confidently giving the wrong answer, but hadn't realized it yet. That look only made Derek more determined to assert his authority. "Are you recording this?" Derek asked suddenly, noticing how still she was standing, how carefully she seemed to be observing everything. "Because if you think you're going to catch me doing something wrong and post it online or file some complaint, you're wasting your time. I'm doing my job. I'm maintaining order in this courtroom." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the lawyers at the counsel table had stopped unpacking his briefcase and was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Another officer who'd been standing near the back wall took a few steps forward, then stopped, seeming uncertain about whether to intervene. "Officer Martinez," the woman said calmly, "I asked you a simple question. I'd like you to state your full name and badge number for the record." "I already did that," Derek shot back. "And you still haven't followed my instructions." "You know what? Maybe you don't understand how serious this is. Contempt of court isn't just some minor thing. Judges don't take kindly to people who disrupt their courtrooms, and right now, that's exactly what you're doing. You're disrupting court proceedings." Tom, the bailiff, tried again. "Derek, seriously, we need to step outside for just 1 second. But Derek was on a roll now. He'd dealt with difficult people before, people who thought they could argue their way out of tickets, people who thought rules didn't apply to them. This woman, with her expensive briefcase and her calm demeanor, probably thought she was special somehow. Maybe she was friends with someone important, or maybe she was just used to getting her way. Either way, Derek wasn't going to back down. "You want to know why this matters?" Derek continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. Because if everyone just did whatever they wanted in a courtroom, we'd have chaos. The legal system only works when people respect it, when they follow the rules, when they understand that there's a proper way to do things. Sandra, the court clerk, had abandoned her desk and was now standing right next to Tom. Her face showed something between panic and disbelief. She kept glancing at the woman, then back at Derek, then at the wall clock that showed it was now 5 minutes to 9. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if she couldn't quite figure out how to interrupt what was happening. I have been in law enforcement for 8 years, Derek went on. I've testified in courtrooms all over this county. I know how things work, and one thing I know for sure is that respect goes both ways. You want officers to respect you? Then you need to respect the institution of the court. You need to respect the process. The woman finally moved. She set her briefcase down on the table in front of her, the same table where attorneys typically place their materials. She folded her hands and leaned forward slightly, giving Derek her complete attention. I'm listening, she said simply. Derek took this as encouragement. Finally, he thought. She was starting to understand. When you walk into a courtroom, you're not just walking into a building. You're walking into a place where justice happens. Real justice, where cases get decided, where people's lives can change. And that means everyone, and I mean everyone, has to follow the rules. No exceptions. Behind him, Derek heard one of the other officers groan quietly. He heard Sandra whisper something urgent to Tom, but he kept his eyes on the woman in front of him. He was making an important point, one that clearly needed to be made. Now I'm going to give you one more chance, Derek said, his voice firm and authoritative. You can walk over to the gallery seating right now, sit down like everyone else and wait for your case to be called. Or you can continue being difficult, and I promise you that will not end well. The choice is yours, the woman nodded slowly. I appreciate you explaining your perspective so thoroughly, she said. There was something in her tone, something Derek couldn't quite read. Was it amusement? Patience? Pity? He couldn't tell. So you'll take a seat then? Derek pressed. Officer Martinez, the woman said, can I ask you something? When you interact with people, do you usually take time to find out who they are before you start giving them instructions? The question threw Derek off balance. What kind of question is that? I know who you are. You're someone who has a case in this court this morning, and you're someone who needs to follow the rules like everyone else. And you're certain about that? The woman asked. You're certain you know who I am and why I'm here? Look, I don't need your life story, Derek said, his frustration breaking through now. I need you to sit down. Tom finally grabbed Derek's arm harder this time and physically pulled him back a few steps. Derek, stop talking. Right now? Just stop. Derek tried to pull away. Tom, what are you doing? I'm handling this. No, you're not, Tom said, his voice low and urgent. You're really not handling this. Several people in the gallery had their phones out now. Derek noticed this peripherally and felt a flash of anger. Great, he thought, now people were filming. This would probably end up on social media with some misleading caption about police overreach or abuse of authority. Never mind that he was simply trying to maintain proper courtroom decorum. You see this? Derek said, gesturing toward the gallery. This is exactly what I'm talking about. No respect for the process. Everyone thinks they can just film whatever they want and turn it into some kind of drama. The woman picked up her briefcase again. She walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom, past the spot where Derek stood with Tom. She moved behind the raised platform where the judge's bench sat, that tall wooden structure with the state seal mounted on the front. Derek watched her, confused now. What was she doing? Tom's grip on Derek's arm tightened. Do you recognize her? Tom whispered urgently. Derek, do you recognize her at all? Derek looked at the woman again, really looked at her. There was definitely something familiar about her face. Had he arrested her before? No, that didn't seem right. Had she been involved in one of his cases? Maybe. The familiarity nagged at him like a word on the tip of his tongue that he couldn't quite remember. Who is she? Derek finally asked Tom. Tom closed his eyes briefly, as if asking for patience from above. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The woman set her briefcase down on the judge's bench. She arranged some papers in front of her, taking her time, moving with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The whole courtroom had gone quiet now, everyone watching, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Derek's stomach started to sink. A terrible realization was beginning to dawn on him, pieces of information clicking together in his mind. The familiar face, the professional suit, the briefcase, the complete calm in the face of his accusations, the panic on Sandra's face, Tom's desperate attempts to pull him away. "Tom," Derek said, his voice suddenly much quieter. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Tom just looked at him, his expression a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. The clock on the wall struck 9, its chimes echoing through the now silent courtroom. Tom leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of someone delivering devastating news. "That's Judge Rebecca Thornton. She was appointed to this circuit court last month. Today is her first day in this courtroom." The words hit Derek like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His mind went completely blank, then started racing at 100 miles per hour. Judge. She was a judge. Not a defendant. Not someone lost or confused. Not someone trying to cause trouble. A judge, the judge. His judge for this courtroom, probably for years to come. Derek's mouth went dry. He watched as Judge Thornton continued organizing her materials on the bench, setting out a notepad, arranging pens, opening her laptop. She moved with practiced efficiency, completely ignoring the stunned silence that had fallen over the entire courtroom. Every single person in that room now understood what had just happened, except Derek hadn't fully processed it yet. His brain was still trying to catch up with reality. "No," Derek heard himself say. "No, that can't be right." "It's right," Tom confirmed, his voice tight. "I tried to tell you. Sandra tried to signal you. We all tried." Derek felt heat flooding his face. His hands had started shaking slightly, so he clenched them into fists at his sides. He'd just spent the last several minutes lecturing a judge. Not just any judge, but the judge who would be presiding over this very courtroom. He'd threatened her with contempt charges. He'd talked down to her like she was a child who didn't understand basic rules. He'd questioned whether she was recording him. He'd given her a full speech about respect and following procedures. Oh God, the procedures speech. He'd actually stood there and explained courtroom procedures to a judge. Derek's knees felt weak. He wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, to wake up and discover this was all some horrible nightmare. But he was very much awake, standing in courtroom 3B, watching the judge he'd just humiliated take her seat behind the bench. Then another memory surfaced, and Derek's stomach dropped even further. The familiar face. He knew why she'd looked familiar. 3 weeks ago. The traffic stop. The school zone ticket. The woman who'd been polite, who'd explained she was new to the area, who'd accepted the ticket without arguing even though she'd clearly hoped for a warning. That had been her. Judge Thornton. He'd given a judge a speeding ticket, which was fine. That was his job. But then this morning, he'd confronted that same judge in her own courtroom and told her she didn't understand how courts worked. Derek's career flashed before his eyes. 8 years of service. A decent record. Plans for promotion. All of it potentially destroyed in one spectacularly stupid morning. He could already imagine how this story would spread through the department. Through the entire courthouse. Maybe through the whole county. The cop who didn't recognize the judge and lectured her about courtroom etiquette. "What do I do?" Derek whispered to Tom. "What am I supposed to do now?" Tom shook his head. "Right now? Stand here and try not to make it worse." Judge Thornton finally looked up from her papers. She surveyed the courtroom with a calm, professional gaze that swept across the gallery, the attorneys, the court staff, and finally landed on Derek and Tom at the back. Her expression gave nothing away. Derek couldn't tell if she was angry, amused, offended, or completely indifferent. "Good morning," Judge Thornton said, her voice clear and authoritative. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The room erupted in a soft rustle of movement as everyone sat down. Derek remained standing at the back, unsure if the instruction applied to him. Tom pulled him down onto one of the benches against the wall where officers typically waited when they had cases to present. "The bailiff will call the first case," Judge Thornton continued, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she hadn't just been accused of disrupting court proceedings in her own courtroom. Derek tried to focus on the proceedings, but his mind kept spinning. Would she hold this against him? Of course she would. How could she not? Would she dismiss his cases? Would she file a complaint with his department? Would she have him removed from the courtroom? Every possibility seemed worse than the last. He watched as Judge Thornton handled the first case, a simple speeding ticket. The defendant was a young guy, maybe 22, who stumbled over his words as he tried to explain why he'd been going 20 over the limit. Judge Thornton listened patiently, asked a few clarifying questions, and then delivered her ruling. She reduced the fine slightly given the defendant's clean record and reminded him to be more careful. The whole interaction took maybe 5 minutes, and the young man left looking relieved. The second case involved a woman who'd run a red light. She had her 2 kids with her in the gallery, and she explained tearfully that she'd been distracted because one of them had unbuckled himself in the back seat. Judge Thornton listened without interruption, her face showing genuine concern. She asked about the child's safety, whether everyone was okay, and then explained that while she understood the distraction, running red lights endangered everyone on the road. She kept the fine but offered a payment plan and suggested a defensive driving course. The woman thanked her repeatedly. Derek watched all of this with growing dread. Judge Thornton was good. Really good. She was fair, patient, and thoughtful. She treated every person who came before her with dignity and respect, even when they'd broken the law. She was exactly the kind of judge the system needed, and he'd treated her like she was an idiot who didn't know which way was up. Case after case, Judge Thornton demonstrated the same qualities. She listened carefully. She asked good questions. She considered circumstances and context. She explained her reasoning clearly. She was firm when needed but never cruel. The attorneys who appeared before her seemed impressed. The defendants left understanding what had happened, whether they'd won or lost their cases. Around 11 o'clock, Sandra called one of Derek's cases. A speeding violation from 2 months back. Derek stood up on shaky legs and walked to the witness stand. He'd testified hundreds of times, maybe thousands. It was routine, straightforward. State your name, describe what you observed, answer questions. He could do this in his sleep, except this time was different. This time he had to sit in that witness chair and look directly at Judge Thornton while he testified. He had to face the woman he'd embarrassed and act like everything was normal. Derek took his seat and placed his hand on the Bible as the clerk swore him in. His voice cracked slightly as he stated his name for the record. Judge Thornton looked at him with that same calm, professional expression. She gave no indication that anything was amiss, no hint of recognition beyond what would be normal for an officer who regularly appeared in court. The case proceeded normally. The defendant's attorney asked Derek questions about the traffic stop. Derek answered them, trying to keep his voice steady. Judge Thornton asked a few clarifying questions herself, her tone neutral and businesslike. She evaluated the evidence, listened to the defendant's explanation, and made her ruling. The whole thing took about 15 minutes. Derek stepped down from the witness stand, his shirt damp with sweat despite the courthouse air conditioning. As he walked past the bench, Judge Thornton looked up briefly and their eyes met. For just a second, Derek thought he saw something there. Not anger exactly. Maybe disappointment, or perhaps just acknowledgement that they both knew what had happened earlier. 3 more of Derek's cases got called that morning. Judge Thornton handled each one professionally, treating Derek the same way she treated every other officer who testified. She didn't make jokes at his expense. She didn't reference their earlier encounter. She didn't show any obvious bias against him. If anything, she seemed to be going out of her way to be scrupulously fair. That somehow made Derek feel even worse. At noon, Judge Thornton called for a lunch recess. The courtroom began to empty out. Derek sat on his bench, his folder of remaining cases in his lap, trying to figure out his next move. Should he apologize? Would that make things worse? Should he just pretend nothing happened? Should he request to be reassigned to different courtrooms? Tom sat down beside him. That could have gone worse, Tom offered. How? Derek asked miserably. How could that possibly have gone worse? She could have held you in contempt for real, Tom pointed out. She could have called your supervisor. She could have made a formal complaint. She's doing none of those things. Yet, Derek said. She's doing none of those things yet. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the courtroom empty out. Judge Thornton had disappeared into her chambers through the door behind the bench. Derek stared at that closed door, wondering what she was thinking, whether she was on the phone with someone right now, whether his career was ending in that moment. You need to apologize, Tom finally said. Properly. Not some half-hearted sorry while you're running out the door. A real apology. Derek knew Tom was right. The question was whether he had the courage to do it. Derek sat in the empty courtroom for another 10 minutes after Tom left to grab lunch. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. Every time he replayed the morning's events in his head, he found a new reason to be mortified. The way he'd gestured at the gallery seating, the tone he'd used, that whole speech about respect and procedures. Each memory was like pressing on a bruise he couldn't eat. His stomach was tied in knots. Instead, he walked the courthouse hallways trying to clear his head and figure out what to say. An apology was necessary, that much was obvious. But what kind of apology? Something formal and stiff? Something casual to try to ease the tension? Something written? Every option felt inadequate for what he'd done. By the time the clock struck 1 and people started filtering back into the courtroom for the afternoon session, Derek had made his decision. He would ask to speak with Judge Thornton privately during the next recess. He would apologize sincerely, take full responsibility, and accept whatever consequences came his way. It was the only honorable path forward, even if the thought of actually doing it made his heart race. The afternoon session began much like the morning had ended. Judge Thornton was prepared, professional, and remarkably fair with every case. Derek noticed small things now that he was paying attention. The way she made eye contact with people when they spoke, really listening instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. How she explained legal concepts in plain language so defendants could understand. The patience she showed when someone got confused or overwhelmed. Around 2:30, there was a brief recess. Judge Thornton stepped down from the bench and headed toward her chambers. Derek stood up quickly, his pulse hammering. This was it. Now or never. He walked toward the front of the courtroom, past the bar, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Sandra, the clerk, watched him approach with worried eyes. "Officer Martinez, can I help you with something?" "I need to speak with Judge Thornton," Derek said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "If she has a moment." Sandra exchanged a look with Tom, who had positioned himself near the chamber doors. "Wait here," she said, then disappeared through the door marked Chambers. Derek stood there, feeling exposed and vulnerable in the empty well of the courtroom. He could hear muffled voices from behind the chamber door but couldn't make out words. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Sandra emerged. "The judge will see you," she said. Tom needs to be present, of course. A bailiff present for any private conversation. That was standard procedure, especially given what had happened this morning. Derek nodded and followed Sandra through the door, with Tom close behind. Judge Thornton's chambers were smaller than Derek had expected but nicely appointed. Law books lined the walls. Her desk was organized, but not obsessively so, with neat stacks of case files and a framed photo of what looked like her family at the beach. She'd removed her judicial robe and sat in her chair wearing just her suit jacket. Somehow that made this harder. She looked more human, less like the abstract concept of authority he'd been dealing with all morning. "Officer Martinez," Judge Thornton said, gesturing to one of the chairs across from her desk. "Please sit down." Derek sat, his back rigid. Tom positioned himself near the door, hands clasped in front of him, expressionless. The silence stretched for a moment. Derek realized Judge Thornton was waiting for him to speak first. Fair enough. He'd asked for this meeting. "Your Honor," Derek began, then stopped. His prepared words suddenly seemed inadequate. He took a breath and tried again. "I owe you an apology. What I did this morning was completely out of line. There's no excuse for it." Judge Thornton listened without interrupting, her hands folded on her desk. Derek continued, the words coming faster now. "I made assumptions. I didn't take the time to understand the situation before I acted. I was arrogant and disrespectful, and I'm deeply sorry. You were just coming to work, doing your job, and I treated you like you were the problem. That was wrong on every level." "Go on," Judge Thornton said quietly. "I've been thinking about it all day," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "And the worst part is, I was doing exactly what I always tell myself I don't do. I looked at you and made a judgment based on nothing but my own assumptions. I didn't see a person. I didn't see a professional. I just saw someone I thought needed to be controlled and corrected." Judge Thornton leaned back in her chair slightly. "Why do you think you reacted that way?" The question surprised Derek. He'd expected anger or maybe a lecture of his own. Not a genuine question. He thought about it carefully before answering. Honestly, I think I got too comfortable in my role. 8 years of wearing this uniform, of people automatically deferring to what I say. I stopped questioning my own judgments. I saw someone doing something I didn't expect, and instead of being curious about why, I just assumed I knew better. Derek swallowed hard. That's dangerous. In my line of work, that kind of thinking can do real harm. Something shifted slightly in Judge Thornton's expression. Not quite approval, but maybe recognition. She was quiet for a long moment, and Derek forced himself to sit with the uncomfortable silence. I'll be honest with you, Officer Martinez, Judge Thornton finally said. When you confronted me this morning, I knew who you were immediately. The traffic stop from 3 weeks ago. I recognized you. Derek's heart sank even further. I'm so sorry about that too. I should have given you a warning. You were polite, you explained the situation, and Judge Thornton held up a hand. No, the ticket was appropriate. I was speeding in a school zone. That's serious. You did your job correctly that day. This morning was different. She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. This morning I made a choice. When you confronted me, I could have identified myself immediately. I could have shut down the whole situation in seconds. But I didn't. Derek looked at her, confused. I wanted to see how far it would go, Judge Thornton explained. I wanted to see if you would pause, if you would ask questions, if you would consider that maybe you didn't have the full picture. And you didn't. You just kept going, getting more and more committed to your version of events. The words stung because they were true. Derek nodded slowly. Do you know why that concerns me? Judge Thornton asked. Because I'm supposed to be better than that, Derek said. Because police officers need to be able to read situations accurately, to consider alternatives, to not just bulldoze ahead assuming we're right. Exactly, Judge Thornton said. In this case, the stakes were low. I'm a judge. I have authority. I was never in any real danger from your behavior. But what about someone else? What about a young person who doesn't know their rights? What about someone who's scared or confused? What about someone who doesn't speak English well, or has a disability, or just looks different from what you expect? Each question landed like a hammer blow. Derek felt his eyes burning and blinked hard. He would not cry in a judge's chambers, no matter how much he deserved this. Your assumptions this morning were based on incomplete information, Judge Thornton continued. But you charged ahead anyway. You were so certain you were right that you stopped seeing the person in front of you. You stopped listening. You just reacted. I know, Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're absolutely right. And I'm horrified that I did that. Judge Thornton studied him for a long moment. I believe you are. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Derek looked up at her. What do you mean? I mean, are you going to learn from this? Really learn from it? Or are you going to be embarrassed for a while and then go back to doing things the same way you always have? She tilted her head slightly. Because here's the thing, Officer Martinez. I'm not going to file a complaint. I'm not going to contact your supervisor. I'm not even going to mention this to anyone outside this room. Derek felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by confusion. You're not? No, Judge Thornton said firmly. But that's not because what you did was acceptable. It's because I believe this experience has already taught you something important. The embarrassment you feel right now? That discomfort? That's valuable. That's what will help you remember this moment the next time you're in a situation where you need to pause and reconsider your assumptions. She stood up, moving around the desk to lean against the front of it, closer to Derek. I was a public defender for 15 years before I became a judge. I saw what happens when police officers stop seeing people as individuals. I saw innocent people get hurt. I saw guilty people get hurt worse than they needed to. And I saw good officers, ones who cared about doing the right thing, make mistakes because they were too certain of their own judgment. Derek listened intently, hanging on every word. You seem like someone who wants to be a good officer, Judge Thornton said. Someone who cares about doing the job right. That's why I'm not pursuing this. But I need to know that you're going to take this seriously, that it's going to change how you operate. It will, Derek promised. I swear it will. Judge Thornton nodded slowly. Then we're done here. You've apologized. I've accepted it. Now we both move forward. Derek stood up, feeling like an enormous weight had been partially lifted from his shoulders. Thank you, Your Honor. Truly. Officer Martinez, Judge Thornton said as he turned to leave. He looked back at her. Remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to be on the other side of someone else's assumptions, and next time you interact with someone, anyone, remember that you might not have the whole story. Derek nodded, unable to trust his voice to stay steady. He left the chambers with Tom, stepping back into the courtroom where the afternoon session would resume in just a few minutes. The rest of that Tuesday afternoon passed in a blur. Derek testified in his remaining cases, and each time he took the witness stand, he found himself speaking more carefully, listening more closely to the questions being asked. Judge Thornton treated him with the same professional courtesy she showed everyone, and gradually, the knot in Derek's stomach began to loosen just a little. When court adjourned at 4:30, Derek gathered his things slowly. Other officers were already heading out, discussing dinner plans and complaining about traffic. The normal rhythm of a workday ending. But Derek didn't feel normal. He felt changed somehow, like something fundamental had shifted inside him. Tom caught up with him in the parking lot. "Hey, you okay?" "Yeah," Derek said and meant it. "Yeah, I think I am." "That took guts what you did in there," Tom said. "Not everyone would have apologized," Derek shook his head. "It was the bare minimum, Tom. I should have never put myself in that position to begin with." They stood by their patrol cars for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Tom clapped Derek on the shoulder. "Learn from it. That's all you can do now." Derek drove home that evening thinking about Judge Thornton's words. Remember what it's like to be on the other side of someone else's assumptions. He thought about all the traffic stops he'd made, all the interactions he'd had over 8 years of police work. How many times had he been too quick to judge? How many times had he made someone feel the way he'd felt that morning? Standing in front of the judge, realizing how wrong he'd been. The next morning, Derek showed up for his shift with a different mindset. He pulled over a driver who'd been weaving slightly between lanes. Instead of immediately assuming drunk driving or distracted driving, he approached with genuine curiosity. Turned out the guy was trying to avoid potholes on a road he didn't know well, new to the city and struggling with an outdated GPS. Derek gave him directions to his destination and sent him off with a warning to be more careful. Later that same day, he responded to a noise complaint at an apartment complex. The old Derek might have shown up with an attitude, ready to lecture whoever was causing problems. Instead, he knocked politely and found a young mother with 3 kids under 5, trying desperately to keep them quiet but fighting a losing battle. She apologized profusely, explaining her husband worked nights and she was alone with the kids all day. Derek helped her move some furniture to create a play area farther from the neighbor's wall, and suggested a community center with a free play group. No citation, no lecture, just help. The changes didn't go unnoticed. His partner, Officer Chen, commented after about a week. "You're different lately, calmer or something." Derek considered telling him the whole story about Judge Thornton, but decided against it. The lesson was his to carry, and somehow broadcasting his humiliation felt like it would cheapen what he'd learned. "Just trying to be better at the job," he said simply. "Well, whatever it is, keep doing it," Chen said. "People respond better to you now." The following month, Derek was assigned to do a training session for new recruits. Usually these sessions focused on procedure and protocol, but Derek found himself talking about something else. He told him about assumptions, about the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than problems to be solved. He didn't tell them the specific story, just emphasized that everyone they encountered had a full life, a complete story, and deserved to be treated with basic dignity. One young recruit raised his hand. "But what if someone's being difficult? What if they're not cooperating?" Derek thought carefully before answering. "Ask yourself why. Are they being difficult because they're a bad person? Or are they scared, confused, having the worst day of their life? Your job is to maintain order and enforce the law, yeah, but you can do that while still treating people like human beings." The recruit nodded, scribbling notes. Derek hoped at least some of what he said would stick. Meanwhile, in courtroom 3B, Judge Thornton continued to build a reputation as one of the fairest judges in the county. Attorneys started requesting her courtroom when they could. Even defendants who lost their cases often left feeling like they'd been heard and treated fairly. Her approach was firm but compassionate, holding people accountable while recognizing their humanity. Derek appeared in her courtroom regularly over the following months. Each time they maintained a professional relationship. Judge Thornton never referenced their first meeting and Derek never brought it up, but there was an understanding between them. an unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened and what had been learned. About 6 months after that infamous first day, Derek was sitting in the courthouse cafeteria during a lunch break when a young officer sat down across from him. Officer Williams, fresh out of the academy, maybe 23 years old. "Can I ask you something?" Williams said, looking nervous. "Sure," Derek said, setting down his sandwich. "I keep hearing this story about a cop who didn't recognize the judge and got into it with her right there in the courtroom. Everyone says it happened in this building. Do you know if it's true?" Derek's first instinct was to deflect, to claim he'd never heard that story. But he thought about Judge Thornton's question. "Are you going to really learn from this?" He took a breath. "It's true," Derek said. "It was me." William's eyes went wide.
"Seriously?"
"What happened?" Derek told him the story, not leaving out any of the embarrassing details. The assumptions he'd made. The lecture he'd delivered. The horrible realization when she took the bench. His voice stayed steady as he talked, no longer feeling the burning shame that had consumed him that first day, but rather a clear-eyed understanding of his mistakes. "Man, that's brutal," William said when Derek finished. "Did you get fired?" "No, Judge Thornton was incredibly gracious about it. More gracious than I deserved." Derek leaned forward. "But here's the thing. That moment changed how I do this job. I was so sure I was right, so confident in my authority, that I stopped actually seeing what was in front of me. And that's dangerous." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if I could be that wrong about a judge in her own courtroom, I could be wrong about anything. Wrong about whether someone's a threat. Wrong about whether someone's lying. Wrong about whether force is necessary. And those kinds of mistakes can ruin lives, Williams. Mine or someone else's." Williams absorbed this quietly. "So what changed?" "I started asking more questions. I started assuming I might be missing something instead of assuming I already knew everything. I started treating every interaction like the person in front of me might teach me something if I just paid attention." Derek picked up his sandwich again. "Sounds simple, right? But it's the hardest thing I've ever done, remembering to do that every single time." "Does Judge Thornton know you're telling people this story?" Williams asked. Derek smiled slightly. "I don't know. Maybe. She seems to know most things that happen in this courthouse." Word did eventually get back to Judge Thornton. Through the intricate network of courthouse gossip, that Officer Martinez was sharing his story with other officers as a teaching tool. She never mentioned it to Derek, but one day when he was testifying in her courtroom, she caught his eye for just a moment and gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement. That simple gesture meant more to Derek than any official commendation ever could. A year after their first encounter, Derek was promoted to senior officer, given the responsibility of mentoring newer members of the force. He took the role seriously, always remembering Judge Thornton's words about whether he would truly learn from his mistake. He shared his story regularly now, not as a confession but as a lesson. Some people laughed at it. Some people cringed. But most people understood the deeper point he was making. Judge Thornton continued her work on the bench, handling each case with the same care and wisdom she'd shown from day one. She never told the story of that first morning herself, though she certainly could have. It would have made for great entertainment at legal conferences, a funny anecdote about the cop who didn't know who she was. But she understood that Derek's willingness to learn from his humiliation was more valuable than any joke she could make at his expense. Years later, when Derek was assigned to train an entire class of new recruits, he opened his first session with them by telling the story of the worst professional mistake he'd ever made. He walked them through every cringe-worthy moment, holding nothing back. Then he looked at their young faces, some amused, some sympathetic, all paying attention. "Here's what I want you to understand," Derek said. "You're going to wear a uniform that gives you authority. People are going to defer to you, listen to you, sometimes fear you, and that power can make you forget that you're still just a person who can be wrong. The uniform doesn't make you perfect. The badge doesn't make you all-knowing. And the moment you start believing it does, that's when you become dangerous." He paused, letting that sink in. "A judge taught me that lesson in the kindest way she possibly could have. Given what I'd done, she could have destroyed my career. Instead, she gave me a chance to be better. So I'm passing that lesson on to you. Treat every single person you encounter like they might be someone who could teach you something, because they probably can if you're humble enough to listen." The recruits left that day with more than just procedural knowledge. They left with something far more valuable. A reminder that behind every badge and uniform was a human being who needed to stay humble, stay curious, and never stop questioning their own assumptions. And somewhere across town, in courtroom 3B, Judge Thornton continued doing what she did best, dispensing justice with wisdom, fairness, and the kind of grace that recognized everyone who walked through her doors was a complete human being, worthy of dignity and respect, even cops who should have known better.